The Omega Man is easily one of Charlton Heston's most underrated science fiction films, a gritty post-apocalyptic thriller that reimagined Richard Matheson's classic novel for the paranoid Cold War era and became a blueprint for every zombie outbreak movie that followed. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 20 things you didn't know about the Omega Man, including how the studio originally wanted a completely different leading man, the film's controversial racial subtext that sparked heated debates, and the guerrilla filmmaking tactics used to shoot in a deserted downtown Los Angeles. Now, the screenplay was penned by the husband and wife writing team of John William Corrington and Joyce Hooper Corrington, who were commissioned by Warner Brothers to adapt Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend for a second time. The original working title was actually The Last Man, but the studio felt it lacked the mythological weight they wanted to convey. The Corringtons had recently gained attention for their work on politically charged television dramas and were seen as writers who could infuse pulp material with contemporary relevance. Producer Walter Seltzer believed they could bring a contemporary edge to Matheson's premise, a lone survivor battling nocturnal mutants in a plague-ravaged world. The couple dove deep into research on biological warfare, urban decay, and counterculture movements, determined to make the story resonate with audiences still reeling from Vietnam, civil unrest, and fears of nuclear annihilation. So, the Corringtons made significant departures from Matheson's source material. In the novel, the infected are traditional vampires, complete with stakes, garlic, and crucifixes, creatures of Gothic horror that represented Cold War paranoia about conformity and loss of individuality. The Corringtons transformed them into albino, light-sensitive plague victims called the Family, zealots who reject technology and blame science for humanity's downfall. This shift reflected the counterculture anxieties of the early 1970s distrust of government, fear of biological warfare, anti-technology sentiment, and the clash between rational science and irrational faith. The Family's monastic robes and ritualistic behavior evoked images of Charles Manson's cult, the Hare Krishnas, and the broader youth movement's rejection of modernity. Matheson himself was reportedly disappointed with the changes, feeling the film diluted his existential horror into a more conventional action thriller. He had envisioned a deeply psychological exploration of loneliness and the gradual erosion of sanity, but the Corringtons prioritized spectacle and socio-political commentary over interior dread. Now, casting the lead role of Robert Neville, the last immune man in Los Angeles, required a star with box office clout and physical presence. Charlton Heston, coming off the massive success of Planet of the Apes and Beneath the Planet of the Apes, was the studio's first choice. Heston was at the height of his science fiction stardom, having become synonymous with dystopian epics where lone heroes confronted civilizational collapse. After starring in biblical and historical epics like Ben-Hur and El Cid, Heston had reinvented himself as the go-to leading man for intelligent science fiction. He was drawn to the premise of a solitary survivor, seeing it as an opportunity to carry an entire film on his shoulders, with minimal ensemble support. Heston was also politically conservative and saw Neville as a rugged individualist defending reason and civilization against irrational mob rule, a theme that resonated with his personal worldview. However, before Heston was locked in, Warner Brothers briefly considered offering the role to Paul Newman, who had expressed interest in science fiction after reading the script. Newman was intrigued by the philosophical dimensions of the story, the isolation, the moral ambiguity, the question of whether survival justified violence but ultimately passed, citing scheduling conflicts with pocket money and a desire to focus on character-driven dramas rather than genre films. Rumor has it that Steve McQueen was also approached, but declined almost immediately, feeling the role was too cerebral and lacking the visceral action beats he preferred. McQueen reportedly told his agent that he didn't want to spend an entire movie talking to himself in an empty city. Heston's casting was finalized in early 1970, and he immediately began shaping the character to emphasize Neville's sardonic humor, intellectual arrogance, and a kind of weary machismo that masked deep loneliness. So, director Boris Sagal was brought on to helm the production, an unusual choice given his background primarily in television. Sagal had directed episodes of The Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, and the television movie The Thousand Plane Raid. But The Omega Man represented his biggest theatrical feature to date. Producer Walter Seltzer wanted a director who could work quickly and efficiently on a modest budget, and Sagal's television experience made him ideal for the fast-paced, guerrilla-style production the studio envisioned. Sagal had a reputation for being highly organized, capable of delivering strong performances under tight schedules, and willing to embrace unconventional filming techniques. He saw The Omega Man as his chance to break into major theatrical features and prove he could handle spectacle as well as intimacy. see. Now, one of the film's most striking visual achievements was shooting in a completely deserted downtown Los Angeles. To achieve this, Sogel and cinematographer Russell Meddy filmed on Sundays and early mornings between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. before traffic filled the streets. The production worked closely with the LAPD to shut down major intersections, allowing Heston to drive alone through empty boulevards in his distinctive convertible. These sequences, showing a major American city utterly abandoned with newspapers blowing across desolate plazas and traffic lights cycling through empty intersections, became iconic and influenced countless post-apocalyptic films, from 28 Days Later to I Am Legend, 2007. The crew had only brief windows to capture these shots, sometimes just 15 or 20 minutes before cars and pedestrians began appearing. The sense of urgency behind the camera translated into the desperate loneliness on screen, and Heston later called these early morning shoots some of the most haunting experiences of his career. However, the film's production design was a masterclass in resourcefulness. Neville's fortified penthouse, stocked with art, weapons, and luxury goods scavenged from the ruins, was built on a soundstage at Warner Brothers. The set was deliberately opulent, filled with paintings, sculptures, books, a well-stocked bar, and eclectic furnishings that suggested Neville had raided museums, galleries, and high-end stores across the city. Production designer Arthur Lonergan wanted the penthouse to feel like a museum of a dead civilization, a sanctuary where Neville clings to the remnants of culture while the world crumbles around him. The contrast between Neville's candlelit luxury and the ravaged streets below emphasized the film's central theme, one man preserving the past in defiance of an apocalyptic present. The penthouse also served a practical storytelling function. It was Neville's fortress, his mental anchor, the physical manifestation of his refusal to surrender to barbarism. So, cinematographer Russell Meddy, who had won an Oscar for Spartacus and shot films for directors like Orson Welles and Douglas Sirk, brought a stark, high-contrast visual style to the film. Meddy used bold primary colors, especially reds and oranges, to emphasize the daylight sequences, contrasting them with the shadowy blue-tinted night scenes when the family emerges. This color-coded approach created a visual rhythm that reinforced the film's dual nature: Neville's sunlit freedom versus the nocturnal terror of the infected. Meddy's use of wide-angle lenses during the empty city sequences amplified the sense of desolation, while tight close-ups during confrontations with the family heightened claustrophobia and paranoia. His work on the Omega Man demonstrated that even on a modest budget, intelligent cinematography could elevate genre material into something visually arresting and thematically resonant. Now, the design of the family, led by the charismatic zealot Matias, played by Anthony Zerbe, was deliberately unsettling. Costume designer Margot Weinz outfitted them in monk-like robes, dark sunglasses, and makeshift hoods, giving them a cultish, Inquisition-era appearance that evoked historical religious fanaticism. Their albino complexions, a side effect of the plague, were achieved through heavy white makeup, pale wigs, and careful lighting that made their skin appear almost translucent. The intention was to make them simultaneously pitiable and terrifying victims of the plague who had rejected their humanity in favor of fanaticism and blamed science for their suffering. The family's visual design drew on imagery from both medieval plague victims and contemporary cults, creating a hybrid aesthetic that felt both timeless and urgently topical. Their torches, medieval weaponry, and chanting rituals positioned them as anti-modern crusaders waging holy war against the last representative of technological civilization. However, Anthony Zerbe's portrayal of Matias became one of the film's most debated elements. Zerbe played Matias as a messianic figure, railing against technology and science with biblical fury, his voice dripping with contempt for Neville's rational worldview. His performance was deliberately theatrical, almost Shakespearean, which some critics found hammy and over the top. But Zerbe later explained that he saw Matias as a tragic figure, a former television news anchor who had lost his mind to the plague, and now led his followers with the same authoritative voice he once used to deliver the evening news. This backstory, which Zerbe developed with the Corringtons, added layers to what could have been a one-dimensional villain. Matias wasn't simply evil, he was broken, traumatized, and clinging to a twisted ideology that gave meaning to his suffering. Zerbe's commitment to this interpretation made Matias one of the most memorable antagonists in 1970s science fiction. So, the casting of Rosalind Cash as Lisa, Neville's romantic interest, and one of the few other immune survivors, was groundbreaking for 1971. Cash was an African-American actress of tremendous talent and presence, and her romantic scenes with Heston, a white leading man, were highly controversial at the time. Interracial romance was still rare in mainstream Hollywood, particularly in big-budget genre films, and the studio reportedly received complaints and threats of boycotts from Southern theater owners. Heston, however, championed Cash's casting, calling it essential to the film's vision of a post-racial future where old prejudices had become meaningless in the face of human extinction. Cash brought intelligence, warmth, and strength to Lisa, refusing to play her as merely a love interest. She insisted on portraying Lisa as Neville's intellectual equal, someone who challenged his cynicism and forced him to confront his own isolation. The Neville-Lisa relationship became one of the film's most progressive elements, suggesting that in a world stripped of civilization's structures, human connection transcends arbitrary divisions. Now, the film's handling of race was both progressive and complicated. While the Neville-Lisa romance challenged taboos, some critics noted that the film seemed cautious about fully embracing its implications. The relationship is depicted warmly, but without the overt passion typical of other action romance films of the era. Whether this was a conscious artistic choice reflecting Neville's emotional numbness after years of isolation, or a studio mandate to avoid further controversy remains unclear. Some theaters in the South refused to screen the film, while others edited out or minimized the romantic scenes. Despite these challenges, the film sparked conversations about representation in science fiction that continue today, and Cash's performance opened doors for other Black actresses in genre filmmaking. Decades later, scholars would point to The Omega Man as an early example of science fiction interrogating America's racial anxieties through allegorical storytelling. However, The Omega Man can be seen as a spiritual successor to classic westerns like Rio Bravo, The Searchers, and High Noon, with Neville as a lone gunslinger defending his territory against hostile forces. The film's structure, extended sequences of isolation punctuated by violent confrontations, mirrors the rhythm of Howard Hawks' survival westerns, where beleaguered heroes hold their ground against overwhelming odds. Heston himself acknowledged this influence, calling Neville a frontier lawman in a world without law. The empty city becomes Neville's frontier, and the family his savage adversaries. This Western DNA runs throughout the film, from Neville's swagger and self-reliance to the climactic siege sequences that echo Rio Bravo's Cantina standoff. By transplanting Western archetypes into a science fiction framework, the film bridged two distinctly American genres and demonstrated how mythic narratives could adapt to changing cultural contexts. So, the film's musical score was composed by Ron Grainer, a British composer best known for creating the iconic Doctor Who theme. Grainer delivered an experimental, electronic score that blended synthesizers with orchestral elements, creating an eerie, otherworldly soundscape that felt both futuristic and primal. The score's dissonant tones, pulsing rhythms, and unsettling melodies reinforced the film's apocalyptic atmosphere, though some critics found it overly abrasive and difficult to listen to outside the film's context. Grainer's work anticipated the synth-heavy scores that would dominate science fiction in the late 1970s and 1980s, influencing composers like John Carpenter and Vangelis. The music served a crucial narrative function, distinguishing Neville's daylight sequences often accompanied by jazzy, almost playful cues as he cruises through empty streets from the horror of nighttime when ominous drones and percussive attacks signaled the family's approach. Now, the film's action sequences were heavily influenced by contemporary war films and urban crime dramas. Neville, playing a former military scientist, engages in nightly battles with the family using an arsenal that includes machine guns, flamethrowers, grenades, and even a mounted spotlight and gun apparatus on his penthouse balcony. Sogel choreographed these sequences with kinetic energy, emphasizing Neville's tactical intelligence and resourcefulness. The film doesn't glorify violence so much as present it as desperate necessity. Neville fights because he has no choice, because surrender means death or conversion. The weaponry also serves symbolic purposes. Neville's high-tech guns represent science and reason, while the family's torches and spears embody their rejection of modernity. These clashes between old and new, primitive and advanced, became visual metaphors for the ideological war at the story's heart. However, when The Omega Man premiered in August 1971, its box office performance was modest. The film grossed approximately $4 million domestically, a respectable figure given its $3 million budget, but far from the blockbuster status Warner Brothers had hoped for. The studio had expected Heston's star power and the success of Planet of the Apes to guarantee a hit, but audiences were divided. Some found the film's philosophical debates between Neville and Matthias overly talky and pretentious, while others felt it didn't go far enough in exploring its ideas. The pacing, which alternated between meditative solitude and explosive action, confused viewers expecting either pure thrills or pure contemplation. Still, The film found a devoted cult following in subsequent years, particularly among science fiction enthusiasts who appreciated its willingness to tackle weighty themes. Drive-in theaters and midnight movie screenings kept it alive, and by the late 1970s, it had become a staple of late-night television. So, the film's critical reception was decidedly mixed. Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times gave it 2 stars, calling it a glib, mechanical thriller that wastes a potentially profound premise on cheap thrills and unconvincing moralizing. He felt Heston's performance was too smug, that the script oversimplified complex philosophical questions, and that the action sequences undermined the film's pretensions to seriousness. Pauline Kael of The New Yorker was even harsher, dismissing it as Charlton Heston's ego trip through an empty city, pretending philosophy while shooting things. She accused the film of surface-level engagement with ideas, suggesting it wanted credit for tackling big themes without doing the intellectual work required. Critics felt the film couldn't decide whether it wanted to be an action spectacle or a contemplative meditation on loneliness and survival, and in trying to be both, it satisfied neither impulse completely. But nowadays it is widely viewed as a seminal entry in post-apocalyptic cinema, a film that laid the groundwork for Mad Max, The Road Warrior, Escape from New York, and the modern zombie genre. Its depiction of a lone survivor navigating a hostile world, scavenging resources, and confronting both external threats and internal demons became the template for countless films and television shows. Filmmakers like George A. Romero and John Carpenter cited The Omega Man as a key inspiration, praising its willingness to blend genre thrills with social commentary. Scholars have reevaluated the film as a prescient exploration of American anxieties during the Vietnam era, fears of biological warfare, distrust of institutions, the breakdown of social order, and the question of what humanity means when civilization collapses. What once seemed like uneven tonal shifts now reads as deliberate juxtaposition, contrasting Neville's desperate attempts to maintain normalcy with the chaotic violence surrounding him. Now, the film's greatest legacy may be its influence on the zombie genre. While the family are not technically zombies in the Romero sense, they retain intelligence, organization, and ideology, their mob mentality, light sensitivity, and single-minded pursuit of Neville, established tropes that would define zombie narratives for decades. Danny Boyle acknowledged The Omega Man as a direct influence on 28 Days Later, particularly the imagery of an empty city, the concept of infection-driven rage, and the tension between survival and humanity. The infected in 28 Days Later, like the family, aren't supernatural, but rather victims of a plague, and both films explore what happens when disease doesn't just destroy the body, but warps ideology and behavior. The Walking Dead, World War Z, and countless other post-apocalyptic narratives owe a debt to the Omega Man's vision of civilization's fragility and the thin line separating survivor from monster. The film asked uncomfortable questions. If you're the last normal person left, does that make you right, or does it make you the problem? These questions continue to resonate in contemporary genre storytelling. But let me know below, do you think The Omega Man is a misunderstood classic that deserves more respect, or is it a flawed but fascinating relic of early 1970s sci-fi? Is Heston's Neville the definitive last man on Earth, or does another adaptation do it better?